Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the MAAT Metaverse for this first event of the Clima Collective. And so this first convening of the protagonist of this year-long adventure. I am Beatrice Leanza. I'm the director of the museum. And the people that you see here surrounding me are TJ Damas, Susan Schuppli, Molemo Moiloa, sorry, Molemo, if I'm mispronouncing your surname, and Paulo Tavares. And they are the first members of this climate collective that we have decided to set off as an initiative at MAAT from this year. And we are joined by Margarida Mendes, who will play MC today, Master of Ceremony for this first conversation. So before I let you take over, allow me to say a few words about the reasons behind this program and this adventure that we are starting today. Already last year, in 2020, before, in fact, the pandemic, took over our lives, we had decided here at MAAT Museum to really make a concerted effort in focusing research and efforts into supporting and sustaining agendas in research and in practice that truly tackle the tenets that are defining our current era from different geopolitical, sociological, and environmental perspectives. We have initiated so from this year, and with the new season and the new exhibitions that we have opened on April 5th, a new program framework, which is called the MAAT Explorations. This is a series of ongoing exhibitions, public program, laboratories, and educational projects that truly want to enter into the complexities that concern environmental transformation and the climate crisis. So last year, I invited TJ to join this quest. So the concept and the idea of actually assembling a collective, so a number of people, of experts in different fields of practice and research to really bring to the museum different geographically positioned perspectives and different scholarly vantage points. The collective program, which of course today will be explained to all of you, will last until the end of the year, and it will feature a variety of different events, both talks, fieldworks, a variety of different projects that have been conceived and conceptualized by these four members. And Margarida will, play the honor also of actually co-hosting one of our upcoming events. So I really want to thank you for your generosity. And I'm really sorry that, this is the first time we are convening, but we are confident that we will be able to sort of transform things a bit. But this takes nothing from the experience I'm sure that this conversation will spark. And as a last piece of information, just for practicalities, of course, you can always go to our digital platform, MAAT Extended, at ext.maat.pt, where a variety of contents produced also on purpose for this program will be featured along the months, and where also the first film in a screening program that the collective has co-curated is already being streamed. But I let you all take it from here. Margarida, so I give you the stage, the meta stage in this conversation. Thank you so much again. And I'll now remove myself from this, but I will be listening from behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bea, for the introductions. Welcome everyone here online. So composed in late 2020, the Climate Collective is an influx collaboration meeting at the invitation of MAAT to conceptualize programming initiatives for the climate emergency Emergence project throughout 2021. Membership includes Johannesburg-based creative practitioner and community organizer Molemo Moiloa, who works on notions of ungovernability, social infrastructures of cultural organizing, and relationships to nature. Brasilia-based architect and spatial politics researcher Paulo Tavares, whose design and pedagogic practice spans different territories, social geographies, and media. London-based documentary filmmaker, researcher, and director of Center for Research Architecture, Susan Schuppli, whose work examines material evidence from war and conflict to environmental disasters and climate change, and Santa Cruz-based visual cultural researcher and curator TJ Dimas, director of Center for Creative Ecologies, who writes on the intersection of visual culture, radical politics, and political ecology, where it opposes racial and colonial capitalism. In the video debate launched at MAAT Extended website today, the collective introduces topics of environmental concern stemming from their research practices, addressing themes such as relational ethics and intergenerational acts of repair, the possibility of scaling social movements versus solutionisms and techno-fixing of geoengineering and top-down state intervention, as well as the legacies of colonial rationale in the present infrastructures of ecocide. Challenging modes of narration and transgenerational political thinking, the collective addresses the friction of different discursive angles, questioning the multiple spaces and politics of both situated and remote sensing within the plural scales of planetarity. Introducing the intersectional political agendas that the debates of environmental emergence request from collectivities and the multiple spaces of the commons, this research group questions forms of alliance and methodological practices, while exposing the urgency of a decolonizing Red Deal versus a technocratic Green Deal, suggesting that we revise the kinds of relational ethics that we need to demand from the institutions from which we work. Today, I will be moderating a brief conversation with the collective, where they will introduce common ecological concerns originating from their practices and their collective debates, as well as environmental reports from the local geographies. They will also introduce topics of future sessions and the moving image component of the project, which is hosted at MAAT Extended Online. I'd like to pass the word to TJ to further introduce the collective and say a few words.
Thanks, Margarida. And thanks for that really insightful introduction to the Climate Collective and our practice and our programming initiative. So we really look forward to this and to also working with you, Margarita, on the next event, which will be in May, and will specifically address the entanglement of environmental and colonial violence in the Portuguese context and in relationship to Portuguese history. Thank you also to Bea for putting this together and having the vision to commit to this kind of initiative. It's a really an amazing opportunity to be joined by also these amazing colleagues that you see within the collective. It's a real pleasure to work with everyone and to address some of these questions. So yeah, so Margarita, should I say something about the program, or what do you think?
Definitely. Let's introduce our viewers, your program.
Okay. I'll just quickly kind of lay out the idea that we're coalescing around, which is to consider pushing climate emergency thinking to the emergence of something new. And by raising that topic, where there's an implicit criticism of the limits of emergency and what that and how emergency might operate to narrow the temporality of democratic deliberation and critical and creative thinking around the enormous question of climate breakdown that we're facing today. So there's a real risk, in other words, of enabling a kind of thought that tends to exclude longer histories of environmental violence that are really crucial to thinking through the challenges of the present. So this is, Margarita, you mentioned in the introduction the resistance that we're bringing to a kind of technocratic or techno-fixed based approach to climate breakdown, which doesn't look at the more extensive and entangled field of socio-environmental effects, disproportionate impacts on vulnerable communities, and basically the direct connection of climate breakdown to the long history of colonial and racial capitalism. I think we would argue. And so if we're not addressing that history, then climate emergency politics risks merely repeating them and entering into a new sense of futurity, I suppose, or what's to come, where there hasn't been any major or systemic disruption of those fundamental problems that have caused climate breakdown in the first place. So we're trying to cultivate different approaches, research practices, ways of experimental thinking that are interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary, that reach out and address different geographies, where we're seeing more of a entangled or socio-environmental or intersectionalist approach to climates. So these would be climates not only of carbon in the atmosphere, but also of social and political and economic powers on the ground. And how can we connect these in thinking about approaches to climate emergency, where the emergency is not simply about global warming or multi-species habitat fragmentation and extinction and desertification and all the symptoms of global warming and climate change catastrophe that we're encountering. But it's also inextricably connected to social and political and economic impacts that are hitting the global south, areas of the earth that are particularly vulnerable to these transformations, so that we're avoiding the presupposition of a kind of generalized universality of those who are affected by climate emergency. So these are some of the priorities that we're trying to bring to this, to avoid the limits of emergency thinking, and trying to look out and see, where practices already exist, where there are already holistic traditions of people that are attempting to bring, especially decolonial and say abolitionist approaches to an emergency that is much more than merely climatological. So those are some of the questions that we're finding really important to think through.
Do you wish to outline some of the events or the gatherings that you're planning throughout the year? I know it's still in the making, but it's nice for people to have an idea of the directions that we're thinking together.
Well, the year is broken up into two halves, and we'll have a summer break. So right now we're planning on the next couple events, and the next one, which I mentioned in May, will be the one that you're co-hosting, Margarida. So maybe you could say a little bit about that. And then the following one will be something that Paulo is thinking about, particularly in relationship to climate reparations. So I think this would be a good chance for each of you to say a little bit more about that.
Paulo, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, let's start with the second one. Can you hear me well? Is that good? Oh, thank you. I'm speaking from Brazil, from Brasilia. Hello, everyone. So my internet is not super stable today. Just today, it's not working super well. So that's why I have to connect through my mobile. So I hope this is minimally understandable. But first of all, I'd like to thank Bea and MAAT for, as TJ mentioned, to convening this collective, and also, for the opportunity to work with TJ, Susan, and Molemo this, and it's a great chance to work on this challenging framework that TJ Demos, together with MAAT, is putting in place. And something that we discussed, I guess, very early on, was the way in which this initiative at MAAT comes at a very sort of crucial moment in relation to the ways we are discussing climate and ecology. It seems to me that when the discourse of the Anthropocene somehow exploded, so to say, Art and museum institutions were trying to address the climate question, but very much through a framework that was understanding, the climate crisis through the sort of universal concept of the Anthropocene that will see everything as, a sort of planetary, sort of shared problem of humanity, so to speak. Therefore, there was a lot of investments in bridging relationships between science and art, and it was very fruitful and very important. And I think that MAAT operating, and this project specifically operating this landscape, so to say, is trying to push the discourse or, the thinking towards something else, in the sense that, as TJ mentioned, it's really situating the climate and ecological crisis in relation to long histories of racial capitalism and colonization, right? And I guess, of course, this is not only a question posed by this collective, but it's in fact a question that we are seeing that being posed by social movements, right, on the streets, as we have seen last year. Social movements challenging the legacies of colonial racism and capitalism, and somehow forcing us, or allowing us to consider that the climate crisis is also something completely embedded and derived from those histories. And I'm saying all this to situate a little bit the second event that I'm co-organizing with my colleagues, which will deal with questions of reparation, climate reparation and climate restoration, in relation to questions of repair of the wrongs and violations committed by the structures of colonial racism and capitalism. And it seems to us, and this is still very much cooking, so I won't speak about names and who are going to be the guests, but it's cooking in very interesting ways. But I guess just to leave you at there, the main point of this program is trying to understand that to restore the climate, right, to restore the earth ecology, we need to address and to repair and to provide reparation for past wrongs whose legacy is still with us, right? And whose legacies still shape not only social relations, but also social relations in relation to the environment. So there is a way in which we are trying to explore this idea that, a reparation of non-human communities can only happen with a reparation of human communities, because those things are entangled. And that's what I think it's really the sort of power of this project, and that I hope we can push, in those discussions further, because the time to discuss climate in a more politically grounded way has arrived. And it's really wonderful to count with a platform, with a museum that's dedicated to art, to technology and architecture, myself being an architecture, that could provide us this ground to convene those collective discussions. I leave to you, Margarida.
Thank you, Paulo. I think most of our events are so much in line. In the environmental humanities, we tend to be weaving a huge carpet with very similar questions, even if we're across the ocean. So when I met the collective for the first time and I started proposing ideas for an event, which will be the May 29th event, it takes place on a Saturday, I was introducing the collective to a series of battles on the ground around, for example, lithium extraction, which is one of our main struggles at the moment, with many concessions in territorial Portugal next to areas that had huge fires a few years ago and that are still under a very difficult territorial planning. So in conversation with the collective, we came to the idea that it would be really important to hold a session on current conflicts in continental Portugal, but understanding the legacies where they come from. So much in sequence with what TJ and Paulo shared, I suggested that we actually start our conversation in former African territories, where we owe so much of our infrastructural rationale here in Portugal. and trying to contextualize how extractivism is, even if it's fossil-free, as the new economical development plan in Portugal is promoting, it still comes from the same, Excel spreadsheets and the same, maps and cartographic planning, the same political rationale. It just hasn't changed. So I've been in touch with many ecological organizations on the ground. I work with an NGO here, Siena, who is mostly connected with marine policy and fisheries. I work mostly on deep sea mining. And I thought that lithium, as being something which is connected with the transition to the renewables, would be something very important to tackle into, because it's supposedly argumented that we need more lithium to have a transition. So to understand why we don't need to go mining neither on the oceans nor on lands, we have to understand how these transitions are made, where they come from in terms of also the energetic rationale behind it, how the distribution of energetic resources comes from. And that legacy is actually coming from, these previously occupied lands, and not only the plantation system, but different infrastructural regimes and machinery that was designed for this distribution of resources. So I think I wanted to address this event that I will call Towards an Environmental Memory, which will join activists, journalists, social movements from different parts of the globe, mostly speaking from Portuguese-speaking countries and different grassroots organizations, but also researchers that have been in Guinea. I'm having, for example, Joana Roque de Pinho, who works on ideas of conservation and how the environmental memory of conservation has been changing around certain policies on a protected area. And she works with farmers. She does this kind of participatory methodology with photographies and audiovisual materials, so trying to rebuild these narratives. And narrative is something I will go back into in some of the questions for the collective, because it's been quite present on the video. Then I will have also journalist and social activist Boaventura Monjane, who will work on social movements from Mozambique and agrarian issues and different alternatives from below. Architect João Ruivo, a fellow colleague at the Center for Research Architecture, where I also study my PhD, will introduce his work on soil politics from the work of Amilcar Cabral, but making also a bridge with the desertification of Alentejo area, which is a southern region in Portugal that is very, very invested in intensive monoculture, mostly with olive oil, but now also with a lot of solar farms. So he's making this transposition between Guinea and Alentejo. Later on another roundtable, so this event will have two roundtables. I'm going to have environmental engineer Julia Seixas speaking of energetic poverty and the issues of just energetic transition and how the legacies of energetic policies come, from ancient energetic regimes of distribution of resources. And also activist Carlos Seixas from movement SOS Serra d'Arga, so from the great lithium battles in Minho, will join us to speak of the condition of the state of affairs. So this is just the introduction to the event. I don't know if anybody else who would like to launch some leads to future events. Otherwise, we can also debate the movie contribution of your interview.
Yeah, why don't we open it up there and see if there's other contributions about some of the issues that you're raising, Margarida, because there's lots of important stuff. And I would just add quickly that in terms of my understanding of the programming ideas behind the collective are to indeed reach out to these practices that are related to policy, that are about analyzing extractive conditions when it comes to new energy regimes, like what lithium proposes, the problems with that kind of energy transition, if it's considered outside of a more broadly based social and political transition. So that's, I think we would try to ask the question, where does energy transition, how does an energy transition relate to a just transition? Because if we're just simply moving to lithium, but we're continuing the same kind of extractive and neo-colonial practices, for instance, in Bolivia, then we have to pause and say, maybe that's, that's not what we want, and there's immense problems with that. So we're also looking at environmental justice traditions, and also, visual practices, cultural, artistic, architectural formations that are attempting to bring these kind of considerations into the realm of culture, broadly speaking. So the Climate Collective is also trying to open up an interdisciplinary space where increasingly these questions in relationship to futures of environmental justice, or a just transition, or a decolonial ecology, or an abolitionist environmentalism, are necessarily cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary, and that's something that has really been felt powerfully within the arts. And I think that the composition of the collective reflects that. And that's basically to say that these questions about what kind of world we want to live in concern all of us. And so there's something that's necessarily inclusive and open-ended about the kind of ethics and politics of our methodology. At least those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. How can we open up this discussion so that it's not a narrow technocratic attempt to deliberate, and it's not just about environmental activism. It's about, most broadly, what kind of world do we want to live in, and how can we include everyone who's necessarily a stakeholder or should be within that discussion?
Maybe if I can add very briefly, just to kind of why we had also thought to start from the position of Portugal. And I think as a kind of group from many parts of the world, it was important for us to hold, and I think we continue throughout the rest of the year, to hold many of the contradictions that I suppose this dialogue and this conversation constantly has to hold in place. And one of those is this engagement very much with the localized, and very much with a kind of centered in place, with localized from the ground up sort of activist positionalities, but then also with these grand kind of global crises and conversations as well. And it made a lot of sense for us as a group of people responding to a brief from MAAT in Lisbon, but not from Portugal, that would be a great space to kind of start from. And so that kind of begins the discourse. But I think that in the same way that holds a certain kind of contradiction, we, over the next number of sessions, hold a number of other ones, as sort of TJ has already pointed to, this contradiction between trying to hold and make space for the fact that we are facing a very real crisis and a sense of catastrophe, and how to make that very much present and very much real in how we engage, but also to posit that within a long durée of history, to understand it within its broader context, and to make much more space for these kinds of intersectional and more creative and open ideas that can feel maybe at the moment of crisis a kind of segue, but as I think Paulo and TJ have pointed to, are absolutely vital to these kinds of critical conversations. And there are a number of other kind of dualities that we constantly hold as a group and discuss and question as a group, and we'll sort of bring to the fore over the next couple of months.
Thank you, Molemo. Maybe I launch a first question as a trigger, and then we take it from there. And if people just want to jump in and also, question each other, feel free to steer the boats along. So actually, I have a question for Paulo to start. Something that stayed with me when I was watching the video is a sentence that you said, or a key concept of ecocide by design, and the infrastructural legacies of neo-fascism as an ecocidal form. So you've been working against forms of land grabbing in the Amazon with cartographic or juridical tools to support indigenous communities in recovering their lands. I would like to ask you if you can elaborate on how one can think of forms of reproductive justice through the land and the rights of future generations in relation to your work, which tackles into the multi-temporalities of extractive infrastructures.
Thank you, Margarida, for that. Yeah, that was a very interesting discussion, sort of informal, that we had among the group. And of course that, some of the reflections in that video are, grounding sort of contemporary concerns from the place where I speak from, which is Brazil, which is, currently governed by someone who has clear necropolitical visions, not only on the populations who, care care for the environment, indigenous populations of Brazil, Maroons communities of Brazil, but also, against the environment itself, right? And I guess that these two necropolitical intents of the government somehow recuperates some ideological constructions of the late military dictatorship in Brazil. And I'm mentioning this to talk a little bit about this idea of ecocide by design. This was the moment during the military dictatorship where, there was an entire sort of, I would say, terraforming, almost, geoengineering project to colonize the Amazon and to transform the entire Amazon basin into a, resource pool for the global economy. And as the Brazilian Truth Commission published in 2014 mentioned, this led to, widespread grave human rights violations of indigenous folks and communities, and in some cases leading to proper genocidal acts against many communities. And a lot of my work is somehow grounded in, trying to mobilize the tools and instruments of architecture as a way of, advocating for those rights. And through that work, what I came somehow to realize is that, this is the moment that the sort of, Brazil military dictatorships from 64 to 84. So this is the moment where, climate scientists are going to call the great acceleration of, the coming of the Anthropocene, because that's when the moment when, all the levels of consumption of carbon, of, chemical products and things like these are going to really skyrocket. But we need to consider that this moment of climate changing that they call the Great Acceleration was also a moment of widespread human rights violations, right? Specifically in the Third World, where the Cold War was not cold, it was a hot war. And, it was a sort of war fought by clandestine means, by paramilitary forces, by paramilitary states that led to the killing of, many activists and many communities that had progressive views. So I guess I'm kind of interested in these two types of relationships, right? How this sort of, violations of rights are related to a certain process of environmental destruction and how those things come hand in hand. And, this process of the military dictatorship, I call this was ecocide by design. It was not a kind of byproduct of progress. It was not a byproduct of modernization. It was, in fact, a plan that was operated. And this plan was somehow entangled to destroy communities inland. And I guess this is somehow happening again. And that's why I think this is such an important topic for us to discuss.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been following the work you do in the Amazon, and it's quite fascinating. It's very, very relevant. I guess I would make a question to Susan. So something that I'm particularly interested in your work is the way how you address how indigenous and empirical forms of knowledge are disputed against, let's say, more conventional forms of scientific knowledge, and how this brings us to a deeper debate about knowledge-making practices, research methodologies, and epistemic divides, which is something that interests the collective. So I'm thinking particularly about your film, Can the Sun Lie? And I wonder if you'd like to address that in relation to what gestures of care or what acts of repair should we aim for while we are conscious of the unsettling political and linguistic inequalities of the climate discourse.
Yes, thank you, Margarida, for the question, but also just quickly echo the thanks to everybody. It's been a real privilege to be part of this evolving conversation. I don't really, Can the Sun Lie is a piece that it sort of lurks in the background, if you will, because there's a kind of contestation in that work, amongst many things, but around what knowledge counts as a form of expertise. And there's a very clear example where scientific expertise in some way not only denigrates and dismisses, but completely erases other forms of knowing, specifically in the case that I was referring to, observations made by Inuit in the Canadian North. And that friction, I think, is still really powerfully operative within, there's my dog. I guess, not sure if you can hear her. As I said, that friction still continues in many different ways, but I have to say, what I found quite illuminating in the work that I've been doing in the last few years around in relationship to a project, I suppose, that has a certain kind of genealogy with Can the Sun Lie, but it's framed under the sort of learning from ice, which is much more expansive. Sorry, my dog is barking. What did I want to say? What was, as I said, what was interesting, because I specifically wanted to focus on the context, certainly of the North, but in particular, sorry. Can you hear my dog bark?
There's no problem with dogs in the video.
Okay.
I think collective, we can go for voting, but Susan, just keep going. It's totally okay.
Distracting because I can, anyway, I'm taking my headphones off so I can manage Uli at the same time. Uli, that's no. What I wanted to say, excuse me. Yeah, I think what I wanted to focus in particular on the circumpolar North, and in part because the project deals with the different knowledge practices that are mediated by something quite familiar, in some way a very ordinary material, ice, but really to look at the ways in which this material, this ecological matter, is at the heart of many different communities and their life worlds and the environments that sustains them. And that is actually a condition that we don't find in the Antarctic. Yet the Antarctic is the site where the primary ice coring operations are happening, where the most significant ice core samples are being extracted in order to forward a whole set of, obviously, policy initiatives, environmental claims, political claims, etc. Ice cores are the single most important material upon which one can make an argument around the, around global warming and greenhouse gas emissions. Uli, shh. But nonetheless, it's a context that has a very specific and unique set of treaty arrangements, and there aren't the frictions of sovereignty. But the minute that there's all kinds of things that emerge once one, in the changes perspective, if you will, where one can in Canada, you can't sort of discuss ice and climate science outside of the many other challenges, and especially socioeconomic, that communities face in the North. It's impossible to simply sort of zoom in on this one kind of particular kind of material. And that can be said for many other, Russia, Alaska, Norway, many other contexts within the circumpolar kind of North. And so it's really, it's been really, really important to pursue the project through that particular context. But I really apologize. I find this really kind of so distracting, but nonetheless, it's the reality. My life with another living being, my dog. What was I saying? Oh, I mean, just a couple of examples. So for example, I'm working with a set of colleagues. In this case, it's a bit different, but within the context of northern India. It's not the circumpolar north, but there's a real issue there in terms of the relationship between traditional practices and the kind of work that glaciologists do. And there is no knowledge sharing, and there's a real necessity to create kind of public hearings and context where traditional knowledge practices, in particular, there's practices of repairing glaciers, intergenerational practices of repair in relationship to glacial meltwater, flooding, etc., that just aren't part of scientific methods and approaches. So in Canada, what's a little bit different and what I found quite significant was, of course, in order to, say, work in the north, one needs to seek permission to work on the land. And that permission, seeking that permission, it's not just a kind of pro forma set of boxes that a scientist has to tick in order to do say, their glaciology or their ice coring, whatever, in the Arctic. It's an ethical demand that you seek permission to work on the land and to extract materials, and those materials have an informational kind of obviously value, but that's a very different framework in which contemporary climate scientists are having to work in northern geographies, and it is actually quite recent, and the understanding definitely is, I would say, quite unequal in terms of how some scientists regard their ethical responsibility towards seeking that permission, and then actually talking about the work that they're doing, etc. So unlike, I guess, to wrap up, unlike the kinds of the situation that I was sort of describing in that earlier video, which seemed a bit more kind of polarized, shall we say, the work that I'm engaging with in the communities and the different voices that are part of that project, we see it's much kind of messier. There's a kind of wide range of sort of responses in relationship to so-called scientific expertise and other modes of knowing and other forms of knowledge kind of practices. But even so, maybe just to end, when I was speaking to, for example, chemists in the United States who are doing this sort of greenhouse gas analysis of methane and CO2, they will always argue that someone working in the laboratory has to be in the field. They have to see how these samples are acquired, like what is needed, how you measure, how you make decisions, there's still an understanding of the necessity for having contextual knowledge of the context out of which your laboratory work then will derive. And so I guess as a practicing artist, I think we also need to kind of complicate the narratives that we're telling about the ways in which science also does its work. So that's been a really interesting process for me over the past number of years. Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. I think you bring up something about different forms of knowledge production that is really interesting in relation to what TJ said previously on the politics of methodology. And maybe this is a broad question, but since we're in an art and architecture museum, I think it would be useful for our audience to hear a little bit from TJ and whoever else wants to jump in about how you envision the role of visual cultures, media, and the environmental humanities addressing these problems of scale and representation when it comes to climate issues, the multiple scales that we spoke and that you address in the video, and the very different situated spaces, geographies, and conflicts that constitute this very fragile space of emergence. So TJ, you have written prolifically on this topic, and most of you are also, artists, so it would be great to hear from you.
Sure, I'm happy to start us out. I think what we've been hearing so far, especially from Paulo, in relationship to ecocide by design in the Amazon, and Susan in relationship to current climate science compared to and often exclusive of indigenous ways of knowing, is in some ways we have to confront the politicization of scale. Because we can't, in relationship to the environmental humanities, which is often coincident with Anthropocene research, we can't simply accept some view from the sky that's completely abstract and global without thinking carefully about how communities located on the ground have been severely impacted by the conditions of industrial modernity and capitalism more broadly, right? So, as Melanie Yazzie, who's a member of the Red Nation, it's a indigenous organization based in Albuquerque in the States, puts it, she emphasizes that indigenous people make up roughly 5% of the world's population, but they protect some 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so, because they've been through such calamity in relationship to colonialism, it's imperative to locate our own conditions of knowing within their informed perspectives, because they've confronted the history of violence. It's so important. So I think that's what Susan was getting at, the significance of connecting these different ways of knowing to, between climatological research on the one hand that tends to be very detached from traditional indigenous forms of science and knowing, and that is a real problem, and that's kind of partly, at least, connected to or even behind the kind of ecocide, which is of course connected integrally to genocide that has unfolded throughout the history of modernity, and specifically Western modernity. So when it comes to confronting what I would say is like the fundamental contradiction of capitalism between economy and nature, or driven by the fact that capitalism sees nature as an endless source of wealth accumulation, of exploitation and extraction, we have to look at specific contexts like the Brazilian dictatorship and the kind of impacts that it's brought to the Amazon and the many indigenous peoples that live in that place, but also expanded in terms of our own awareness of the scale of capitalism that's become global, to the knowledge and awareness that this is happening and has happened all over the earth. So the question is, I think, for us in terms of an environmental humanities methodology, how can we avoid scaling up to a kind of abstract climatological knowledge that repeats some of those exclusions and disenfranchisements that Susan was talking about? How can we ground these different scales so that we're thinking from the perspective and in direct relationship to land and water protectors when it comes to questions of environmental violence? This is all really crucial as I think an imperative to think carefully about scales, their entanglements, and the dangers of abstraction. So just quickly, I think this is something that the visual culture and artistic practices are really uniquely situated to provide ways of telling stories, of producing imagery, interrogating representations in ways that I think we can learn a lot from and think with. So I think that's one of the really amazing things about and environmental arts that are emerging these days in the environmental humanities, but one that's critically aware and really thinking about these broader connections to the socio-environmental and the histories of colonial, the colonial Anthropocene, or as Françoise Vergès puts it, the racial capitalocene.
I agree, TJ, and I really see creative practice as kind of, it operates at the level of the interscalar, and I think it really can really sort of mediate incommensurate realities, and I think that's really kind of crucial. So it's not that we're simply shifting sort of scale, but there's a kind of radical incommensurability. And art is, I think, that's one of its very kind of productive attributes, can really act as a mediator between these incommensurate kind of worlds, ideas, context, situations, right? So it's not that we're, as I said, it's not an act of kind of zooming, this sort of vertical kind of zoom, but it's rather, how do we develop methods, approaches, ways of creating kind of relationships that can't be reconciled, and what is it that we do to activate those different realities productively, or with a sense of, say, critical proximity, in fact. Yeah.
Molemo, would you like to react to that?
Sure.
As I was gonna bring you into conversation, yeah.
Okay, go ahead. If you have a different question, I can respond to that. Sure.
No, please react to that.
Okay, yeah. Good. I mean, I think that what Susan's really pointing to in this idea of other forms of knowing or other ways of knowing is really the kind of vital center of that. And that the primary question is a kind of a need for a total epistemic and ontological reimagining, and a move away from what TJ has described, but this sort of broader supremacist, patriarchal sort of space of Western modernity needs to be completely reimagined, and it is the space of creative practice and artists, I think, to drive that reimagining. And within my own work, much of my interest is very much in how we might cite this reimagining in everyday practice, everyday kind of quotidian life of Black and majority world peoples, and particularly in order to think through sort of modeling or strategizing from existing experiences of revisiting, restructuring colonial and racist inheritances, and creating something very new out of that. And as Susan says, in many ways, artists are well placed to bring these kinds of spaces together, these spaces that otherwise can feel difficult to bring together. That said, I do think that the scalar question remains a question for all of us. It remains a sort of ghost in the background, as much as we are able to critique it. It remains a question I think we will need to unpack collectively and bring other great minds to think with us as we go along.
Maybe, I don't know if I can you hear me? Just jump for a brief comment, Margarida.
Yes, we can hear you. Jump in, of course.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, I just want to say something briefly about the question of arts and, creative practices. And I'm not sure I'm going to be clear in what I'm trying to sort of think, but, I want to try this out anyway. What is the role of sort of art and, of new forms of representing in sort of, opening up imagination to artistic practice? There is a way in which, colonial modernity was really a sort of imposition of a hegemonic culture, right? And that process was really saying, everything other than Western is somehow from the past. So there was a process of erasure of those cultures, right? But that process, also implied what one may call epistemicide, right? Which is the erasure and the killing of forms of knowledge. And what this generated is really what I would like to call one of the most powerful ideological constructions of colonial modernity, which is the imposition of a single vision, of a single idea of nature, right? That's one of the most sort of durable, enduring political legacies of colonial modernity, and it also a very racialized vision of nature as one thing, as something to be explored, as a commodity, as a resource, and of course, in the field of arts, as landscape, right? And I guess, the question of a cultural hegemony, I guess with globalization, after the fall of the wall, artists and artistic practice, and the concept of culture itself became very important politically and artistic in order to challenge the sort of imposition of an hegemonic notion of modernity, right? And that has been very important and also led to the opening of a new field, which is visual cultures, one could say, right? In which we should understand art in a different manner. So it seems to me that, today, artistic practice, we should create a kind of field called visual natures or something like that instead of visual cultures, in the sense that we need to challenge the imposition of this hegemonic vision of what is a landscape, what is a nature, and really open up to different possibilities of understanding and engaging with the world. And I guess, this is happening many different fronts, for example, in law, in ideas of rights of nature, for example, and, TJ created a whole exhibition on that topic very early on, which I guess is a sort of precedent for this project. And it really opening up, not only denouncing extraction, not only, exposing environmental violence, but also open up for new forms of imagining, conceiving and relating to this other world, right? This other than human world. And I guess, artistic practice today, they have a very important role in really, offering the public a new possibility of conceiving, as Jay mentioned in the very early on, what is the world we want to live in? And to conceive this world, we need to reimagine our, the very idea of nature itself, and decolonize, that hegemonic concept, which is, something we still sort of attached to, so to say.
Thank you, Paulo. I think this is a great trigger actually to introduce the moving image piece that the collective has selected for the online platform from Tirza Can Kutant. It's a film called Reclamation from 2018. Who would like to say some words?
I mean, I can just say that I think what's fantastic about that video, and I hope that everybody watches it if they haven't already, but it's precisely the point that Paulo is making. I mean, it's obviously it's an incredibly kind of like succinct analysis, is very sharp, witty, but it places imagination at its core, right? And in some way, it kind of conflicts between multiple imaginaries, the colonial imaginary that couldn't figure out, that actually moves to another planet because it doesn't have the imagination to actually deal with the repercussions and consequences of all of the violence and ills that it has wrought. There's a lack of imagination on the one hand, and then there's the necessity for new, it's not even, it's reimaginings, but it's also the imagination that has always been part of, say, indigenous ways of knowing, doing, of indigenous cosmologies. In this case, two First Nations artists based in Ontario. And so throughout the video, they continue, the refrain of imagination is a kind of continuous refrain. So it's not about imagining a different future. It's once the sort of white colonizers who have destroyed the planet are now have left, the work of imagination is really to kind of reclaim in some way an indigenous way of, an indigenous imagination that is already vital and exists, but now has a chance to sort of flourish. But of course has a sort of monumental task that it's faced with as well at the same time.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. And I'd like to agree with that. And also, I would nominate Uli, Susan's dog, as an honorary member of the Climate Collective. I think really that's what Uli is trying to say and request. So I'm happy to include Uli.
Thank you.
But in the reclamation is also, I think Paulo's proposal for thinking about visual natures is great. It's a really, useful terminological approach. It reminds me a little bit of it connects to Eduardo Viveiros de Castro and Brazilian post-humanist anthropology, and what Viveiros de Castro calls multinaturalism. Also what Donna Haraway calls nature cultures, where nature itself is a site of conflict, and there's not one singular nature which would produce the kind of epistemicide that Paulo was mentioning, that's part of colonial modernity, to impose its vision, its singular vision on nature, of nature on everyone else. But rather nature is a set of conflict, and there's different visions. And the way Thurza's video produces this conflict of a colonial nature that is defeated ultimately by an indigenous nature in this vision of reparative futurism, I think is really amazing. And the way it's done, as Susan mentioned, it's funny, it's humorous, it stings, but also it's like incredibly poignant and says so much in the brief 13 minutes of its unfolding. It's really an amazing video and speaks to a lot of our ideas about connecting futurity to history and thinking through these entanglements of colonial and social and natural violences as they've been carried out in the past. That's the basis from which any future can be imagined.
Yeah, I really recommend viewing. It's quite humorous and something that sticks with us, this film. I would take the chance to read 2 brief questions from our audience who's watching online, and whoever wants to pick them, they're quite short. So the first one goes, the restoration of non-human communities depends on the restoration of human communities, said Paulo Tavares. So what measures are being taken to change the world in that sense? And the second question says, what regenerative spaces of creation and renewal do we have now to experience new forms of knowledge? They're quite wide, but I guess we could have.
Yeah. So maybe
Molemo?
just because you mentioned, then oh, sorry, somebody else want to jump?
Please jump in, and
so
then Molemo.
Very briefly, just so to have a chance for everyone to also address that. I think if we look at history and we look at social movements, we always find an environmental dimension, in resistance. And I had the opportunity of doing a long work in North America and, getting in touch more closely with the movement of civil rights. And it was interesting to me to notice that there was a kind of environmental, architectural dimension to civil rights, a spatial environmental dimension to it. If you look to the work, for example, of Chico Mendes, the famous environmentalist of Brazil, shot by the late military dictatorship. Actually, he was not an environmentalist as such. He was a, union leader. You see that he was, his vision of environment was really also addressing, the rights of assembly, the rights of political organization, the rights for you to have, land. He called it a land reform. He was not protecting the forest, for the sake of the environment in itself. So I guess in a way, this idea that restoration of the climate is restoration of communities, or that those things are entangled, right? That justice to people is just to the climate has always been there somehow, right? Has always been there. And I guess, Margarida, your meeting will address this, particularly through the sort of revolutionary thinking of Amilcar Cabral, which is completely sort of entangled with questions of land, right? So yeah, in that way, I would say it's not something of the now, but something of those struggles, anti-colonial, anti-racist struggles, anti-capitalist struggles that has always had a sort of dimension that is environmental, in the sense that it's an intersectional question, which the film shows so well, right? And sorry, just the late point on the film very quickly. What is also beautiful in the film of Tirza, and it's touching very, very much. I even wrote her to thank for the film, it's really how, you know, this sort of healing future is also a queer future, right? It's also the end of patriarchy, you know, it's also the end of different forms of oppression. So, you know, really posing the questions, but there's not an environmental question. Every question is environmental because it's intersection.
Thank you. Molemo, please.
Thanks, Margarida. I think that very much in agreement with Paulo that, and I will also actually speak to the film because I think it is so multifaceted and complex. One of the things that I really enjoyed about it is that though the storyline is quite wild, in some senses, there's also a very strong presence of kind of ordinary life and ordinariness. And I think that that offers in the sort of everyday, very sort of lo-fi the quotidian also as sites of resistance. And I think works really well against or in relationship with the kind of spectacularness of crisis. And there's a South African philosopher, Njavula Ndebele, who speaks to the reclaim of ordinariness. And perhaps in connection with what Paulo's saying is that I think in many ways what we need to do is to sort of reach in and claim those spaces where this work is already happening in a long kind of period of time in multifaceted kinds of ways, very much often in hidden ways that are not necessarily called environmentalism, and to visibilize those, to connect those, and to make those very present.
On this note, because we are a little over the hour, I would ask if there are final comments from TJ or the collective, or we soon wrap up.
Margarida, just quickly. Yeah, sorry. Just quickly, I'd like to thank Margarida for asking the questions and framing the discussion in this way, and it's been a real pleasure to have this conversation. Every time we do so, there's always new stuff coming up, and that's something I'm really enjoying about collective practice. Is this thinking together, and that's based on the premise that any proposal for the future is not going to be based on any one of us. It's going to be precisely through that collectivization of research and knowledge, and that's what I'm very excited about in terms of the program ahead. So I really look forward to it, and Margarida's next event sounds really amazing.
Thank you. Susan, you're about to say something.
No, I just wanted to make respond to that other question that went unanswered because the person asked it, and it was just to say that I think within the context of the work we're trying to do, it's not always about the production of kind of new knowledge, but it's more questioning what counts as knowledge. What are the kind of practices that are actually out of which understandings might emerge in different perspectives, or renewed understandings might emerge. So it's less about the production of new kinds of knowledge, I would say, but rather an expansion of what counts as knowledge, and who counts as someone who worthy of listening to, of paying attention to. So I think that's all I wanted to say, but it's a really important kind of question, so I'm glad it was raised. And once again, I too thank you, Margarida, for your wonderful moderation of this first event.
Well, thank you all for joining. I guess we stay with a lot of questions for the next meetings. So we'll be meeting monthly, online and on site. And I'm sure there will be media channels also to exchange future thoughts, and a series of videos coming in through the online platform. Thank you all for joining. I'm staying geological, so I have to go towards my backdrop. Nice to see everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you very much.